Hello, everyone. I guess it's good morning for you, ohayou gozaimasu, and it's a good evening for me. Um, uh, well, thank you, everybody, for being here. And sorry I can't be there in person. And I must say that I'm not a big fan of Zoom talks, and I'm not. Some people are very good at giving them, and I'm not necessarily one of those people. Um, I, I, for that reason, I broadcast my talk so you can read along with it, especially given that the sound hasn't been good. These things are to be expected. Okay, I'll just dive right in, and then hopefully it'll make sense. The title is Aboriginal Life, the Art of Living Life as the Sugata of the Great Life. My paper today focuses on a number of elements of Nishitani's philosophy that point, I believe, to the conversion in life that must be made if we are to abandon the current path of destruction, path formed by greed, hate, and ignorance, the three poisons of Buddhism that result from the fundamental darkness of Aveda. This path has brought us to the environmental crisis that confronts us and the social political crisis that divides us. They are but two symptoms of the same disease. The environmental and social political crisis is the logical consequence of a worldview that has long been disrooted from the fundamental experience of life. The problem, as I see it, is that while we have become fully cognizant that we live in different worlds that express different forms of life, different ways of living life, both human and non-human, we have no sense of living in a shared common world that is the expression of life tout court. As Nishitani already suggests in his 1938 text, the human beings have become divorced from each other, and the human from the other sentient beings, and ultimately from life itself. Thus, while our age promotes the values of cross-cultural dialogue, openness, and tolerance, it is dominated by tribalism, identity politics, and cultural wars. And while we are concerned with the environment, it is largely out of self-interest. We seem more interested in the sustainability of our exploitation of the earth than a fundamental conversion in our way of life. I would contend that until we can recognize the culturally other the humanity we share with them, and until we can recognize in the sentient other the life we share with them, we will continue along this path of destruction, and life will get shorter, nastier, and even more brutish than it already is. For Nishitani, overcoming our current situation, a situation he calls nihilism, requires a conversion in life that breaks through the egological citadel of the self in all its forms, and a transcendence back to what I will call aboriginal life as a fundamental experience of our naked being in the world as such, a sheer being in the world in a straightforward sense, existentially more essential than being in the world as human, to speak with Nishitani. This aboriginal life signifies the living in the dialectical movement of life as life, which is apparent in all sentient forms. It is a return to the pre-scientific, pre-Cartesian aboriginal experience of the living of life in which there is a lived sympathetic affinity between one form of life and others, a return to not just the fundamental experience of the interconnection of everything, but to the experience of the interdependence of everything, to the experience of the co-arising of everything in the moment, the kairos of life. It is a mode of existence in which each form of life is rooted in the bottomless conditions of existence. It is the infinite fullness of life, such that every individual life is an original, dynamic, figurative appearance of great life, always a species of great life, such that all forms of life can be seen as our sisters and brothers speak with Daniel Wildcat and St. Francis of Assisi. Central to his essay on Nietzsche and Eckhart is the relation between the image or form and nothingness as the elementary source and nature of life. It is a rethinking of the Buddhist position set out in the Heart Sutra in terms of the contradictory interdependence of form and life. Form soku life, life soku form. It is through the mechanism of the soku that the non-dual duality and interdependent co-arising of all forms of life are manifested and experienced. In the Aboriginal worldview, every form of life is and is not life, and it is the intuition of the interdependence of every form of life with every other form of life within life itself. Aboriginal life is the life of the present moment, and this present moment is originally the present into which the past and the future feed as the moment of vision, Augenblick. Aboriginal life is able to abide or dwell in the originary form of life because it grasps the world not as a rigid being, but as a constant event, not as a finished gestalt, but as an ever-renewed metamorphosis of life. It lives in an intuition of the impermanence or endless becoming of life without why. It is a moment in which life expresses itself in every moment of life. The kairos is the fundamental experience of an infinite openness beneath, or better, inside the presence as the bottomless source of the present. That is the fundamental experience of impermanence. The chaos is not, however, the one found in Christian theology, which is the presence of the end of historical life, the fulfillment of life that occurs in the appearance of Christ, nor is it Heidegger's kairos of the Augenblick in which Dasein retrieves its forgotten being towards death, the nility of its existence. Nishitani's kairos is a paradoxical experience of the intersection of the present, of the everydayness of the here and now, and the bottomless ground of life, emptiness. It is an open-ended event of the infinite fulfillment of historical life in the radical finitude of the present of everyday life. Aboriginal existence is a living out of life as the kairos of the living presence, the living of life as life. It is the fulfillment of the historical life that connects the inside and the outside, the subjective and the objective, life and form. Aboriginal thinking must, in one and the same moment, introduce through a dynamic figurative appearance of the immanent flow of life, a rupture of transcendence, an aesthetic presencing of the transhistorical, that is to say, the infinite fullness of divine life that gives form to historical life, and at the same time, live out this transhistorical ground as the immanent existential being in life as life. The movement of transcendence ruptures the immediate immanence in the flow of a lived existence of being in life as life and provides it with its logos in the double sense of its logic and expression. Aboriginal life is thus a life of radicalized living, where living is being and being is living, a life of sheer becoming, a life that gives expression to the dialectical movement of life, where it can be said, form soku life, life for soku form. Or, as Nishitani states in his text, it is the absolute negation soku affirmation or expression of the infinite fullness of life. In Aboriginal life, life is infinitely transcendent and infinitely immanent. We see throughout this text that life must give itself form, or it is precisely through the alterity of form that life gains its visibility and reality. Life is always a creative living and movement of Bildung as the formative action of poiesis. That is to say, Life is the creative power of the productive imagination. However, the life form that is produced becomes attached to its own existence, to its fixed edos of its being, and closing up within itself forms an isolated world that divorces its historical life from the elemental nature of the infinite fullness of life, and by extension separates and even isolates itself from all other forms of life, be they human or non-human. At the beginning and end of this text, Nishitani speaks about the fracture that comes about in the self-awareness of human life as a life in form. Throughout the text, he also speaks of the function of the image in the forming of life. From the beginning, humans have created images and adorned themselves and their world with them. The production of aesthetic images by the imagination is, without doubt, the quintessence of the being of human. For wherever we find a human, we find those beings who not only contemplate themselves and their world in and through images, but who create themselves in light of their images and end by transforming themselves into their own image of themselves. Human historical life is a life in the realm of the imago of life that is in constant danger of slipping into a mere simulacra of life. It would seem that for Nishitani, the visibility of nature is the actual, even the only goal of the imagination. It is through the imagined image that life and spirit acquire the form of their visibility, if not their reality. However, by wrapping itself in clothes, it forgets the infinite depths lying at the bottom of its naked self. By surrounding itself with four walls, it forgets the endless heavens that enveloped it and enveloped even its sheltering roof. Clothing beckons the need for a mirror. Since the time early humans painted their faces in clay and saw themselves mirrored in reflecting waters, the human being lost its immediate feeling of life and obtained a now deep-rooted habit of grasping itself with the reflective eyes of others. How one is seen or heard has taken the place of natural being, aru, as self's existence. The imagined self delimits the sphere of our world and determines the historical nature, while it evolves from nature. I can't do that. Sorry, can you still hear me?
Yes, that's better.
Given the importance of the image and the imagination in this essay, it is surprising that Nishitani does not refer to Kant's third critique, but only to the first and second. Nishitani appears to distinguish in the text between kiso and sugata. Kiso can mean a look or expression, form or appearance, or as has been translated, edos. It is through the fixed edos that the dynamic flow of life is dammed up into a static, enduring presence of a life possessing its own fixed center. It is a unique manifestation of life in life, but not as life. For Nishitani, all scene of life is formed by a sight of historical spirit through which things attain their look and a people their outlook, to speak with Kassir. Thus, the standpoint of spirit, divorced from living, nevertheless arises within living, as spirit is ultimately a living. Even where spirit is divorced from the elemental source of living, the elemental nature of living appears. In contrast to the static, enduring form of edos that is ultimately divorced from the elemental living of life, Nishitani speaks of the sugata that I will translate as a dynamic figurative appearance. For Nishitani, the term signifies the aboriginal life as a visible appearance of the dynamic flow of life. That is, it is the dynamic figurative appearance of a life, living life as life. In Kuto Soku, which we read last time, Nishitani writes, quote, along with a single flower quietly opening in the world, manifests itself under a new phase of life and motion. This is the world worlding in a dynamic figurative appearance of occurring. Everything is in motion and stillness, end quote. And it is no, I believe, coincidence that Sugata is the name for a Buddha, a well-gone one who has gone to goodness, who has achieved the liberation from the surging panorama of samsara. Both the way of the Sugata has taken, gata, is good, su, but where the Sugata has gone is good. The Sugata has returned to the elementary source of divine life, to our innate and natural nature, beyond the suffering in the world brimming with malice, beyond the falsehood of the world, not the falsehood found in the world, the falsehood of the world itself. The Sugata has transcended the ontological self-identical essence of the fixed edos, what is called the Sava, the Umbeing in the Heart Sutra. It is the dynamic figurative appearance, which the Greeks called epiphany, literally a shining through of the infinite fullness of divine life in a historical form. In the dynamic figurative appearance of the Sugata, the dynamic infinite fullness of the divine life gains its visibility and manifests itself in the world as a living of life as life. When great life fills the self, the water of life breaks through the shape of the cup and overflows. Any edos that remains, even if the self were to become empty, is rejected from within. The self is no longer something substantial. Neither is it a fixed center of conscious activity. It is something that can take on infinite number of forms without having any form. It is the life of a dancing current wherein infinite species fuse. The transient shadows of shadows. We encounter the term Sugata at key points in the text. After speaking of how humans have forgotten the infinite depths lying at the bottom of their naked self, Nishitani writes, they are perhaps a rarity, those who could, from a bit of fish on their plate, envision its swimming dynamic figure appearance in the Kurosho current. Indeed, rarer still are those who feel directly beneath them that life runs in common through the fish and themselves. And after speaking of the ecstasies of awakening to life in Plotinus, Nishitani asks, does the dynamic figurative appearance, Sugata, of Zarathustra leaving the woods and seeking the mountain peak not remind us of the soul ascending the stages of Plotinus's hypostasis? After speaking of breaking through the edos of the egotidi in the self's return to the elemental source of life that forms the oneness of God in the self, Nishitani then writes, only in such a Durchformen, Soku Überformen, can we say that God's eye and my eye are one eye, one glance, and only there does the elemental source of living reveal its absolute noetical nature in its true dynamic figurative appearance, the Sugata. Finally, while reason is said to be divorced from the natural nature and rising above the all-too-human town, one can return it to the elemental source where it becomes a great manifestation of natural life. The arrogant loftiness of the reason is negated, and reason merges once again with the depths of life that is its source. lofty reason, Nishitani writes, is not real, but a mere image, a mere built, an imagined sugata, subordinated to the imagination. The mere image, the form or image, eidos, of the dynamic figurative appearance of our living life as life is but an empty, illusionary abstraction. Nishitani effectively reverses the relation between logic and life here. Whereas Hegel understands life from the standpoint of logic, Nishitani understands logic from the standpoint of life. Nishitani has focused on Nietzsche and Eckhart because each speaks from a fundamental kairos that defines their historical moment, a critical moment in the historical life when great spasms spread from the bottom depths of history out over the entire surface of culture. The crisis in historical thought is the catalyst of their respective returns to the elemental source of great life. The Aboriginal life and thought dwell in the awareness of the gap between the infinite fullness of divine life and the historical form of life. In the moment that the historical form of life is brought to its Untergang by the dialectical movement of life that is always transcending itself without ever leaving itself, spirit must return to the wellspring from which it arises and be reborn. Nietzsche and Eckhart stand together in the blazing present moment of living bottomless depth. They stand, so to speak, in a life of living. They have returned to what I have called the Aboriginal life. I have chosen the term Aboriginal to express the immediate living of life as life that lives beneath the knowing eidetic self, but of which the ego is not aware. That is, the ego is not aware of itself as the self-presentation of the elementary source of life, but itself thinks that being noetic is something that emerges from out of the ego itself. It fails to recognize the elemental nature of living that had already originated within the soul from the eternal beginning, up origine. That is that which I must have been since the eternal beginning. Aboriginal life is able to dwell in the flow of life. It is one with the elemental nature of life. It is the art of living life as life in dharmic naturalness. In this sense, it can be said to be truly primitive. That is, an originary or radical living of life as life. Translators have avoided the term primitive, given its contemporary negative connotations. And for this reason, I have adopted the term Aboriginal life. From the perspective of Aboriginal life, a crowded line of houses stands equal with a row of trees, and conversing humans are equal with singing birds. In Aboriginal life, there is a universal sympathy of life. As Nishitani writes in Religion and Nothingness, the pre-scientific domain of Aboriginal life is dominated by an idea of life as a living bond, and on the basis of the life that linked individual things together at bottom, a sympathetic affinity. And this same affinity exists not only among men, but among all living things. In the final version of this paper, I will continue to consider what I call the fracturing of spirit that has brought us to the crisis in which we find ourselves today. In short, I would like to argue that philosophy and religion both revitalize themselves in and through their engagements with Aboriginal life as an existential living of life as life. Whereas philosophy seeks to know the ultimate reality of living, the infinite fullness of divine life, religion seeks to live it. However, as Itsamatsu has said, religion without philosophy is blind, philosophy without religion is vacuous. Nishitani frames this in this text as a conflict between faith and reason. Faith, I would argue, must be distinguished from belief, which belongs to a believer and has an object that is believed, whereas faith is a fundamental experience that opens the world. It is a silent commitment to a practice of awakening, of a knowing and living life as life. It is the art of living life as the Sugata of the great life, of being present here and now, being touched by the infinite fullness of life in all its forms, be it human or not human. To close, let me end by returning to the conversion in life required to confront our current environmental and social political crisis. Perhaps what is needed today is less talk about our individual rights and more living according to the principle of Ubuntu. The Bantu notion of Ubuntu means I am because we are, and it is akin to the Buddhist, what the Buddhists call interdependent co-arising and compassion. And Thich Nhat Hanh writes in being peace, if you want peace, we have to be peace. Peace is a practice, not a hope. And as for the environmental crisis, again, Thich Nhat Hanh writes, this beautiful, boundless, life-giving planet we call Earth has given birth to each one of us, and each one of us carries the Earth within every cell of our body. Environmentalism must not be about the sustainability of our lives, but about the profound gratitude for the life that we have been given. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Steve. And there was also someone clapping, so enthusiastic reaction. So if someone wants to put comments or questions. So, Baba, please.
Yeah. Can I speak into this?
I hope so. Can you hear Saba's voice?
Steve, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. Very good. Okay. I guess one thing I would like to ask you about is from this issue of Aboriginal life, in your reading of this text, what is the difference between how the saint is living and Zarathustra? I think in that first part of the essay, Nishitani wants to distinguish what Zarathustra is doing from what the saint was trying to do. So I'm curious then, from this perspective of Aboriginal life or living life as life, what's the difference between the two there? What does Zarathustra do that the saint can't or hasn't been able to yet?
Well, first comment, it would be that Nishitani seems a lot more sympathetic to Nietzsche in this text than I would have thought. And this is one of the things that sort of threw me, because one of his critiques of Nietzsche is going to be that Nietzsche still is postulating a will. And so it hasn't achieved what he needs to do. So he has a fairly well worked out critique of Nietzsche later. And I think here, because he's doing this seminar in the presence of Heidegger, he has maybe buffered that critique. That's the first comment. Second, if my first comment stands and has some justification, then I think we have to read past a bit what he's saying to what he interprets. I think there's a definite development in Nishitani's thought from this text to his later work. Here, what's called primitive, or I'm calling Aboriginal thought, it's all present there, but it's being pushed aside still. And I think later on it develops within 20 years, 1956, when he does the problem of myth, and then when he's dealing with what is religion, you see, especially the last two chapters, when he writes, so by the time he gets to there, the presence of what is myth, and I've used Aboriginal, becomes much more prevalent. So I guess part of my paper is to say that what he calls sheer being in the world, which I'm calling Aboriginal thinking, is already implicit in this expose of life. And I don't think that Nietzsche was entirely useful for his project. So, and then finally, to get back to what is in the text, the difference between Zarathustra and the aesthetic. The aesthetic stays at the level of, the saint stays at the level of essentially a denial of the world. And Zarathustra goes up to and has a transformation, but he then returns into the world as a good bodhisattva and has to enlighten the world by destroying, helping people destroy their idols, to overcome their dogmas. That's where the fire has to be brought down and destroyed. So if you meet the Buddha, kill the Buddha. So the Zarathustra, the saint is Zarathustra, is the sort of history of Zarathustra, if you will. It's what he used to be. He went through that phase too. He also went through the forest, but then he left the forest, the negativity. He left the civilization into nature, but he hasn't been able to achieve the balance. The saint has rejected all of the human, and that's not on for Nishitani. And Zarathustra has climbed the mountain and become awakened, but then he also returns. And I think that the way he's reading that is generous. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, I think that reading is really helpful, especially I think so in Religion and Nothingness, in this text, that final very difficult section or chapter of that text, and when he introduces this idea of sheer being in the world, this too, though, he also qualifies as being kind of one step before. It's I guess in that text it would have been shunyata without its interdependence with samsara, right? Or nirvana without its interdependence with samsara. And so I suppose if we read sheer being in the world as being something like the state of the saint, then I guess in the later text we can also see this reflected in this shunyata that's still kind of divorced from the actual world that hasn't, as you said, kind of returned back to the human world.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to be a good parallel that runs through these decades of his thinking.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
I have a question if no other persons want to intervene. Steve, thank you very much. When I had several questions, but I focus only in one. What you call Aboriginal life reminds me somehow the Greek difference between Zoe and Bios. Zoe doesn't die and Bios can die, and so on, as Karl Kereni pointed out, for example. And so my question is, in your opinion, what you call Aboriginal life can die or not? Because you started with the problem of environment, ecological problem, and so on. So in my opinion, we are facing the possibility that what you call Aboriginal life disappear, is completely destroyed. This is, I think, the essence of our time, the end of the world, the end of the Aboriginal life could occur. But in your opinion, can Aboriginal life die, or we are safe in this sense?
I think if Aboriginal life were to completely die off, be completely negated, then I think the human would no longer exist. And I think all sentient life would have to cease to exist. It is the manifestation of life itself.
So,
I'm willing to push it. I'm willing to push this idea far enough to say that Aboriginal life, of course, I'm distinguishing Aboriginal life from indigenous life, cultures, and I'm arguing that all life forms are fundamentally attuned as forms of life to life. That you can't have life without this type of embodiment. And so if there was no Aboriginal life, there would be certainly no human, and I would say there would be no sentient life at all. I don't know what that would be.
But so I couldn't understand. So do you think that Aboriginal life can die or not? Not the individual life, not human life. Of course, human life can die, is obvious. But the Aboriginal life can die or not? And if you think can die, what is this kind of death that can let Aboriginal life die?
I don't think it can die. I guess what I'm saying. I think it's the nature of divine life, and so it makes no sense to say that, in that sense, it's the unborn, and therefore it doesn't die. It wasn't born, it doesn't die. It is something that just always is. It's an infinite. It's the infinity. So it makes no sense to the question of whether it dies would insinuate that it has some type of limit. It is precisely something that is without limit.
Oh, yes, okay. So I understand your position is quite common, is in the philosophy of life. You agree with the old Greeks that Zoe cannot die, that Dionysus cannot die. So it's nothing new in this sense. Okay.
No, I think we
anyway. Tobias? Okay.
Yes, please. Yes, and also in regard to the question of Aboriginal life and how Nishitani in his text introduces this idea of the original life when he begins, which is the strange reference to Carlyle and that the beginning of evil is when man started to use clothing and lost his original nakedness in a sense and began to reflect himself as if in a mirror, and linking these metaphors of clothes and mirror and reflection and self-objectification, and thereby a kind of mortification that comes with clothes, and the loss of this life that seems to be this original life in a primitive sense. And I wonder if there isn't an ambiguity in Nishitani, an ambiguity insofar as I understood your talk to go more in the direction also in the use of your metaphors of aboriginal and primitive, of a kind of an attempt to return before that stage of the introduction of clothing and kind of rediscover a kind of original primordial nakedness that was given before, as he says, clothes were introduced, so before the first fatal look into the mirror happened. But I wonder, isn't also another reading of Nishitani possible in that one might read him as that in a sense, it is not about kind of undressing again and going back to the Aboriginal before that clothing, but rather that in a certain sense, this experience of self-objectification as a self-negation of life is not radical enough, in the sense that man is not clothed enough, or rather that this what he calls then the great life is not so much discovered before this negation of clothing and civilization and mirroring and reflection happens, but rather more in the direction of a result that comes after going through that passage of self-negation, in the sense that for example, also in regard to the question of the saint and what is involved there with discovering this original nakedness, that Zarathustra is not so much returning to nature where the saint is stopping halfway between humans, but in a sense, Zarathustra goes even further in negating his human nature, whereas the saint still retains something of that nature, in the sense that I see this other reading possible in Nishitani, that negation does not go far enough in the saint, whereas precisely Zarathustra is the one who overcomes all things human and all things divine, and in that sense really enters this negativity that begins with reflection or clothing, and I think this is a different trajectory, and I'm not sure if this corresponds to your, if this could be or how this would relate to your reading that emphasizes this primitive or aboriginal dimension of life. To see what, yes, I wonder how you would respond to. So if you see the difference, or if you, yes.
Well, it's a complex question you're asking, and I'm having a hard time hearing it, so I'm not even sure if I heard it all correctly. There is a tension in Nishitani. That's clear. There's clearly ambiguities all the way through, and I think those are intentionally left. I think he doesn't shy away from even ambiguities and ambiguities. You know, a number of times he says something like something, 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 but things are not quite as clear. Right? Things are never as clear as that. So I think he's constantly trying to work with ambiguities, because I think the second you try to clear up the ambiguities and make it too black and white, this is when you stray off the path. Second, in this text, what struck me was this use of the word Untergang, which I know Nishitani and Nietzsche uses, but in the context of 1938, I couldn't help but think of Spengler's Untergang, because part of this, the whole frame of this text, is not just the Nietzsche and the Eckhart, it's the last section in which he says, the only reason I'm interested in these people is because of their historical crisis that they grew out of. And so I think he's implicitly saying, you know, my own work is coming out of a crisis. And, you know, Eckhart's work came out of the crisis of the death of Hegel. And Nietzsche's work came out of the death of Hegel and Thomas, and Nietzsche's work came out of the death of Hegel and the disarray. And so I was reading the Untergang is from the perspective of Spengler. And if you do that, this text takes on a very different sort of cyclical meaning. So I understand why you would want to to read that and focus in on the Nietzsche as being more radical of a negation. And I do think there is a negation of a negation going on there. That's clear in the text. But I also think that Nishitani wants to have some type of naturalness that we're always there. I mean, the text is full of terms like becoming. I'd have to look them up, but there was these terms where you're constantly becoming something. But of course, for Nishitani, we're already that. We're already this natural existence. We're already Aboriginal nature. It's just that we have forgotten it. And so we have to, it's a process of not of establishing something that we're not. It's a process of overcoming a sort of forgetfulness. But you can't. That's the paradox. I'm not sure how to answer your question. You always ask very good questions, and
don't you think that that Nishitani is being very opportunistic in his riff on Nietzsche here? I mean, the whole idea of the Übermensch and the arrow of desire towards another shore, towards a beyond of human existence as we know it, is missing in Nishitani. That's not what, as you said, he's interested in Aboriginal life, which is not exactly what Nietzsche is interested in. But besides today, there's a big clash because of the ecological crisis. We're all tending to think of bios and not of zoe. We're thinking of survival, of animal survival. We're in dread of nuclear extinction, and we're just hoping there is life on somewhere else in the trillions of galaxies. And really our thinking of life has become the crudest form of bios, of survival. And the wonderful Lebensphilosophie and the glorification of Zoe is well, it's true, of course, that ecologists do tend to have a mystical idea of the life of the earth, of Gaia.
Well, I agree that I think his reading of Nietzsche here is very selective. And that's kind of my point. It's been extraordinarily selective, and so if you just read it and don't think about it, it becomes a very sympathetic reading of Nietzsche. It's trying to read his project into it, and again, I think it's in part because he's sitting in front of Heidegger, and it's in part, and it doesn't dovetail with his critique of these other aspects of will, and so that's why I'm sort of reading past them to seeing what I think is underneath the logic of this. As far as your statement about self-survival, I fully agree, and that's my point. We will not deviate from the path we're on by sustainable growth. Sustainable growth means I have a slave and I beat it and it dies, and some come up to me and say, well, you know, if you keep beating the slave, they will die. And I go, okay, so you're saying I should beat it slower. And you go, yeah, that's the point. Just sustain its growth. So sustain it. So don't beat it too hard. So you will have a slave that, until you switch that around and realize we're basically, you know, if you take, you know, the idea that all other sentient beings are our brothers and sisters, we're raping our sisters and we're slitting the throats of our brothers. And until we think that way and think we should not be polluting the world, not because of sustainability of our life, but because of compassion, and say we don't do that to our own family members, why would we do it to somebody else? And until we have that gestalt switch, we're just going to continue down the road we're on. And all the talk about sustainability is for naught. I totally agree with you.
We're a bit like the last man, right? We think we've got the formula.
And we blink a lot. We know the truth. And that's, I think, part of Nishitani's point, is that we know the naturalness, but we blink.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, final question, comments, please, Jim.
Can you hear me all right, Steve?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes. Along the same line, you begin your paper with a question about ecology and the environment, sustainability. And in other words, you begin by asking the question that Nishitani doesn't ask himself. And at the very end of your paper, you make a remark about all of life, be it human or non-human. My problem is that in the text of Nishitani, I don't see any bridge from the anthropocentric to the anthropo-eccentric. This is a problem I think that Nishitani shares with Nishida, and that mind and consciousness are the primary paradigms for the so-called aboriginal life. And so in the beginning of the paper, Nishitani uses the word human life, as do you, and then it gradually changes into just life. That seems to me a very big leap. And that any kind of sanctity based upon that kind of belief is rather suspect. In other words, a no-self that remains an event in the skin-bound consciousness of the individual is not enough for a philosophy of life. So my question is this: is there any way within Nishitani's thought system to fix this? Or if you want to repair this problem in his philosophy, can you find a way to make a bridge from something in his thought to a little wider perspective that you have and that many of us share today?
Okay. I'm always amazed how you go right to the point. Okay, I think I'm going to answer it twofold. One, I'm going to say I think that within Nishitani there is gestures towards a moving beyond the human, and that's the sheer being in the world that he says is existentially more primordial than the being in the human as human, being in the world as human. So he says that in chapters, the second last chapter of What is Religion. It's called, the sheer being in the world.
And that would refer to animals as well, as
Yep,
Joseph.
It does. It does, and so.
But there's some reference in him to non-human life, as sheer being in the world.
Yes. And so I think if he's not developing it to the level he should, I think that the framework is there. The idea that there is I have this world, I go inside the world, and I have a social political world. I keep going down, and as I descend, I eventually get to a world that I share with all sentient beings. I sit there in my own little bubble, but if I analyze it, my bubble is part of a larger framework. And if I keep analyzing, these frameworks just become larger and larger. And I think that the Mahayana Buddhism provides them with that framework. That's I think what I would argue. And if he doesn't explore it to the degree that I would like, I think you could use that to get there.
Thank you. Okay, and I see that Professor
I don't know
Moore,
does that answer, Jim?
Yeah, that's a start, I think. Yeah, no, a good start. Yeah.
So Professor Moore, I said Jim was the last one, but if you have a short question, we can add it.
Okay, I'll just express it very quickly. Thank you very much. So it's more of an expression of shared confusion about what's going on with regard to Nietzsche in the context of Heidegger in the late 30s. And so you mentioned this passage where logic is about life before it's about sort of propositions, forms of thinking or rules of thinking. And that seems to me quite Heideggerian, that negation, for example, is an existential matter before it's a logical matter. So it seems like there's a nod to Heidegger there. But what I'm puzzled by, and maybe you can help me think through this, is that Heidegger's developing his critique of Nietzsche around this time. I don't have the exact date for it, and yet Nishitani reads Nietzsche in a very positive way, almost against Heidegger. I mean, it seems to me that it would be surprising actually to hear this presentation in the context of Heidegger's developing critique of the voluntarism of Nietzsche. So I'm just wondering whether you thought about that at all. That actually this isn't a sort of nod to Heidegger, but actually might be a resistance to what Heidegger's thinking at the time.
Yeah, I wouldn't have any idea of how to answer the question. I mean, it would be speculation. I think that the fact that Heidegger is sitting in a room and there's some other people out there is definitely affecting how Nishitani is presenting. Heidegger's, the will to will is, I guess, what you're referring to. And is what's suspiciously absent from this text. In fact, I don't see any reference in this text at all to Heidegger.
And remember that he would have heard Heidegger speak. He wouldn't have had access to the text. So it's not necessarily clear that Nishitani would, at the very moment Heidegger was speaking, have grasped the subtle implications of Heidegger's discourse, which is very difficult to pin down. It goes on for years, and
yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, so Steve, if you want to add something.
No.
Okay, so thank you very much, Steve.
Actually, I think Nishitani first. So, I think Heidegger, Nishitani first engages with Heidegger on Nietzsche when he has access to the text in Holzwege, the text, Nietzsche's Wort, was ist, Gott ist tot. Nishitani engages with that after it is published, and he understands it better, I think, then than he did when he was listening to Heidegger back in the 30s.
Mm-hmm.
And that Holzwege is 1950, so it's much later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Steve. And I'm sorry, but we have to move to the next speaker.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.